Jon, welcome here to the Reagan Library. It's great to have you here. First question I'd like to chat with you about has to do with the news cycle. What do you think the 24/7 news cycle has done for magazines, and particularly NEWSWEEK?
Well, everything is sped up by a factor of one, at least one. But for instance, in the Reagan era, which is a good point of departure, you had a situation where newspapers did what the web does now. Deliver headlines, deliver context, do it quickly. Newspapers, in reaction to that, have understandably moved more toward a news magazine model. There are longer stories, there's more context. They assume, many newspaper editors today assume that you basically know the headlines and that you're looking for some added value. That puts us in an interesting position. If newspapers are trying to do what Time and Newsweek did exclusively for really the post-war era, then what can we do? Our answer is that you try to do a topical magazine with monthly production values that gives you enough context, enough original reporting, enough original voices that you feel in the maelstrom of whether you're being Twittered or Blackberried or whatever the next verb will be, which we probably don't know yet, but there'll be one tomorrow probably. You feel that this is a moment to take a deep breath, to step back, to understand things in a way that is really more thoughtful. And it's funny, I've been doing this for 14 years, and the idea that having 2 or 3 days to think about something would seem like a luxury would have been hilarious to me, would have been improbable to me early on. Early on, mid-90s, when I started doing this, I thought, well, my God, the fact that we get through it every week is a remarkable achievement. I mean, it's just so hard to do it every week. Now, given that everyone else is doing so much, and really on an hourly basis, then having 2 or 3 days to put something together, to think it out, really, I think, gives us a comparative advantage, as Adam Smith would say.
Okay, but what's interesting about that, you talk about being thoughtful.
Yeah.
Okay, the younger generation, the millennials or the Gen Xers or Ys, do you think they have the patience or do they want to be thoughtful?
I think they want to be thoughtful. Whether they fully engage with the kind of literary journalism we're trying to do is a fight we have to win. As President Reagan would say, markets make good decisions in the end. And so we're in the marketplace of ideas, we're fighting it out. But, you know, I think this is a very engaged generation. What President Obama has proven is that you can bring people in. You know, for years and years, a lot of us talked about younger voters or new voters, and my friend Joe Scarborough liked to say he knew lots of non-congressmen who had relied on young voters to show up, and they were back selling insurance. But that did happen in 2008, and I think there's an enormous appetite, particularly in these economic times, particularly given the way the world is, for as much information as possible. What's changed is, whereas previous generations built up a kind of brand affinity for, okay, we're going to find out what Newsweek has to say about this, or what the New York Times has to say about this, or what CNN has to say about this. When you go online, it's everything. It's asymmetrical warfare. A lot of us grew up with a Cold War model. And so right now, what a lot of traditional institutions are in the midst of is trying to figure out, how do you compete in an asymmetrical era? My bet is to be counterintuitive, to say, to reinvest in the magazine, to really put all our chips, most of our chips, on paper, on the idea that there are several million people a week and more around the world who want to hold a magazine in their hands and engage with it. And we have a wonderful presence online. But that's a different thing. To try to take a magazine or a newspaper and simply put it online is, to allude to the man whose library we're sitting in, it's like taking a radio broadcast and putting on television. It doesn't quite work. You have to, they're both different media.
But is your medium, magazines and newspapers, are they still viable today? And let's say 5 years or 10 years down the road, do you think they're still economically viable?
I do. I think we've been doing magazines since 1704. So we're at 305 years. And magazines have always been an extra part of someone's life. And so our goal has to be to make sure that we are remain as essential and relevant enough that people will believe that they can profitably spend time with us. The economics are changing rapidly. I mean, we're sitting here on a day in which two of the most fabled American companies may or may not survive the next 60 days, General Motors and Chrysler. I think it would be foolhardy to try to say anything about 5 years out. What I do know, and what I think our politics and our culture and our history have taught us, is that quality wins out. If we compete, if we give people something that is worth their time, the marketplace ultimately rewards you.
Speaking of 5 years, it's been 5 years since President Reagan has passed. Do you think Americans have changed their perspective of him? And what about the media's perspective?
I don't think, with the possible exception of President Lincoln and President Roosevelt, FDR, I don't think any president at the time of his death, and those were two unexpected deaths, has enjoyed a greater historical reputation or a more rapidly growing one. I think it's remarkable when you think that when he left office in 1989, he was not the vivid, largely universally admired figure that he is today. We were in the shadow of Iran-Contra, deficits were tough, it felt as though we'd come to the end of a conservative era, if you accept the Schlesinger view of the cycles of history. But rapidly, he grew ever stronger and ever more popular in, I think, the wide historical imagination because of what happened that he had put in motion. What happened in November of 1989? The wall came down.
Absolutely.
What happened in 1990, the coup in Russia? What happens in 1991, the Soviet Union ends? So people came to appreciate him in a way that not everyone did in real time. My point of departure, my landmark on this, is when Richard Reeves, a friend and a great journalist, but not the most conservative guy around, wrote a largely respectful and even somewhat admiring book about what Reagan was like day to day. That was a key watershed moment. When Sean Wilentz, the Princeton historian, wrote The Age of Reagan and found more virtue in Reagan than he would ever have been allowed himself to have said in 1988 or so. It's really remarkable. And so President Reagan will be among the top 10 presidents for the foreseeable future. It will come and go. That happens. I just finished a biography of Andrew Jackson, who's had moments of great popularity and not so great. And he didn't do anything different. He's still dead.
Right. What do you think the current administration can learn from Ronald Reagan?
Constant communication with the country. Don't worry about what people like me say. Don't worry about what reporters say. Don't worry about cable television. Can communicate your message as consistently as possible to the broad whole of the American people. Whenever President Reagan spoke over the heads of the press corps or of Washington or of New York, he did extremely well. He did it for the tax cuts in '81. He did it throughout his term. And President Obama, has a very, I think, strong grasp of the Reagan virtues. He committed what Michael Kinsley called a gaffe in Washington. The gaffe in Washington is when you tell the truth by mistake. When Obama said, Reagan changed American politics forever, Bill Clinton did not. You can imagine who was thrilled to hear that. The 42nd president, I think, is still sort of pink about that. He understood that Reagan had big ideas. He stuck to them. He communicated well. And I think President Obama shows every sign of being of that school. I must admit, I kind of smile sometimes when people say, well, Obama's overexposed. Only people in the press think that. I mean, people want their president to be working hard, to be making the case to them, particularly in times like these. This is not dissimilar to 1981-83, when President Reagan came in. And in many ways it's worse, but I don't think we knew that until recent months. I think that the other thing about President Reagan that I think is wildly underappreciated is the fact that he was a labor negotiator. Here's a man who would ask for 1,000 and settle for 500. but his 500 was better than anybody else's. So what do you have? In 1981, you call the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world. What are you doing by 1988? You're kissing babies in Red Square. This is a guy who knew how to make a contract. And I think Obama is too. Less experienced than Reagan was when he came to power. But there's an innate ability, I think, with Obama that was also true of President Reagan. And I know this, whatever your views, whatever party you're in, right now we need this man to succeed in the same way we needed Ronald Reagan to succeed in the 1980s.
What have you learned from Ronald Reagan?
Good Lord, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for Ronald Reagan, weirdly, I admit. He was the president of my childhood in the way that President Roosevelt was for many people and President Kennedy was for many others. I don't think I would have had this as strong an interest in politics as I did if he had not been on the scene. I never met him, which I regret immeasurably, but he communicated a kind of persistent belief in the possibilities of politics that really is more associated in the popular mind with Kennedy or with an FDR, but Reagan was the same way. As President Bush 41 would say, there are a lot of things you disagree with Ronald Reagan about and you'd argue with him, but at heart, he believed in the country. He believed that we had come through storm and strife. We'd done, what did he say? We've come from the swamp to the stars. And I think that essential hope, tempered by realism, tempered by the fact that, government grew under Ronald Reagan by 7%. He picked his fights. He was not an all-or-nothing guy. He was not a bitter ender. He knew how to govern, and he had that amazing capacity. Could all of us in our lives do this, to absolutely convince his true believers that he was absolutely with them while he was doing very little to meet what they thought was most important. I think about the religious right, for instance, enormously important to Ronald Reagan's election and governance, but he talked a lot about their issues, but did very little to bring them to pass for various reasons, perfectly legitimate reasons. But part of that political magic of his was to convince them that he was on their side. And I think that's something that all of us as we move through life could use more of.
Speaking of moving through life, you've been here to the Reagan Library and you've been through the Discovery Center. What would you tell high schoolers or junior high schoolers about President Reagan and how that might influence or affect their lives?
Well, one thing that Ronald Reagan teaches anyone of any age, but particularly younger people, is you don't really have to pick one career. Here's a man who succeeded in 4 or 5 different ones. Between acting and radio and labor leadership and corporate leadership at GE and politics, he also was quietly ambitious. There was no more ambitious man in the 20th century, perhaps, but you never saw it. He was always in office before you noticed he was running for it, and that required a certain kind of grace. And I think he was always very gracious about his opponents in life. He was not a mean, tough campaigner. He was a tough campaigner, he wasn't mean. If you compare him, for instance, to the other president from California of recent times, President Nixon, you have night and day in terms of their styles. And yet it was Reagan who was sort of the softer political figure who ended up being more successful. So there's a lesson there that a habit of mind in which you're more likely to give the other guy a break or the benefit of the doubt is probably a virtue, not a vice. And I'd say the capacity to have big ideas, to talk about them consistently, but to know when to compromise. And there's no shame in compromise. Politics is the art of it. And again, one of the marvelous things about Reagan is somehow or another he could compromise cut deals, and everybody came out thinking that he had been absolutely with them. So whatever alchemy that was is something to come here, learn, and try to hope it rubs off on you.
Well, thank you for joining us here. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you,
I
sir.
wish we had more time.
Thank you.